So today I wanted to go back and take a look at the recent free expansion DLC for Sea of Thieves. Sea of Thieves, for those of you unfamiliar with the game, is an online cooperative action FPS game developed by Rare, the developers of classic popular games like GoldenEye and Donkey Kong Country, and aimed predominantly at a casual audience. While Rare-made games have largely been generally known for their tongue-in-cheek sense of humor, Rare mainly has set aside any pretense or attempt at subtlety with this more overtly lighthearted, arguably satirical approach with their interpretation of pirate legends and mythology. Instead of running from British naval forces like most other pirate games, players were here blasting themselves and their animal companions out of cannons, getting horribly drunk, and idling around on the ship playing music using a variety of instruments, all in a very colorful world with soft, cartoony textures and models. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Sea of Thieves. Sea of Thieves has faced some turbulent waters, if you don't mind me saying so, since it launched back in March 2018. Chiefly among the complaints voiced, a lot of players, including myself, were disappointed by the severe lack of variety in many of the game's core components, including the types of quests, referred to mainly as voyages, that players could undertake, as well as the limited number of enemy types and the rather overall bland combat. Another reoccurring criticism was the game's lack of overall focus, as the developers seemed torn as to whether to tailor the experience predominantly for either the PvE or PvP audience. Rare seemed to understand that they needed a more cohesive vision for the game, while also addressing many of the community's core concerns. While Rare did make several substantial improvements between 2019 and 2020, arguably one of their biggest new additions, if not the biggest, was the introduction of Tall Tales in version 2.0, released on April 29, 2019, along with 2 new NPC factions you could do quests for, as well as a few other additions. Subsequent updates double down on the more cooperative elements, such as the Fort of the Damned, a new PvE-focused skeleton fort, followed up with a overhaul to skeleton forts in general, which were fire and lava-themed forts designed to provide players with more of a challenge. Summer 2020 expanded on these areas as player versus AI combat was expanded to include naval combat opportunities as well, with ghost ships being introduced along with more AI bosses, including world bosses that introduced an almost raid-like element to the game, often requiring multiple teams of pirates to cooperate in order to defeat the boss. Then, oddly enough, Rare unexpectedly stopped producing major content updates, and instead spent the later half of 2020 putting out almost exclusively cosmetic-only updates, often accompanied only by a limited number of vendor or faction-specific quests, and/or limited-time seasonal quests. Given how consistently productive Rare had been up till this time, I assumed at the time that they were probably hard at work on something big, either being an outright sequel, or at least some new major expansion or update. It turns out that the latter was indeed the case in more ways than one, as 2021 has seen the release of both. The first being a game-changing update in January 2021, which reworked how progression worked in the game, complete with a new leveling system that rewarded players for their in-game activity, and further reinforced grind as a core gameplay component. However, in correlation with the new update's reveal, Rare announced that they would be discontinuing all future content planned for the PvP-exclusive Arena game mode, and would instead focus exclusively on the game's story-driven content and more PvE open-world elements at large. What I find funny is this was also, I believe, around the same time that Amazon likewise announced that its upcoming MMORPG New World would be dropping its PvP focus in favor of PvE. While Sea of Thieves may have launched in a questionable, somewhat disappointing state, I feel it would be more than fair to say that Rare as a developer has done an excellent job, arguably going above and beyond initial expectations with these aforementioned updates, turning Sea of Thieves into the game it should have been at launch, and thankfully the game's community has been incredibly loyal and supportive, which is honestly great to see. I personally love redemption stories, and Sea of Thieves, from a development perspective, has certainly been a fine example of that. And this all leads up to where we are today, with A Pirate's Life. I don't think anyone, even those unfamiliar with Sea of Thieves as a game, and are just watching this video out of curiosity, would be surprised to hear that the game, in large part, was influenced by Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean films, among other things. So a crossover between the two distinct IPs seemed to be a natural fit. Clearly, Disney and Rare both agreed.
For this new Pirates of the Caribbean story, we were excited to work with Rare. With Rare, we immediately knew we had found a team that was up to the challenge of taking what fans love about Pirates of the Caribbean from the theme park attraction and the films and building something new.
They looked at our game, they recognised the tone and the humour and the kind of the fantastical nature of it and everything, and I think they saw like a kindred spirit, I guess.
We started by just having fun, imagining the possibilities and pushing each other in new directions.
Rare, with Disney's oversight, was granted full permission to use characters, locations, and assets from the entire Pirates of the Caribbean world, including not only the films, but the original theme park ride itself. And ultimately, it was the ride itself that, I would argue, would go on to eventually take center stage. In a pirate's life, the player, or players, depending on if you're playing in a group, have to rescue Jack Sparrow's soul, which is trapped in the underworld with the ferryman, the Sea of Thieves character who sails between the worlds of life and death, and team up with Sparrow on an epic quest to save his ship and crew, which suffered similar respective bad fates, while simultaneously fending off the likes of Davy Jones, the Kraken, mermaids, giant crabs, and other new monsters. Before we even get into the full analysis, let me just say I was very impressed with how much content there was in this expansion, in terms of both length and quality. A lot of expansions, including paid expansions, these days tend to be very short in length. Most of the Destiny 2 expansions, for example, tend to range between 4 and 8 hours long for an average playthrough. A Pirate's Life, on the other hand, averages between 8 and 10 hours long. My playthrough, personally, was a bit over the 9-hour mark, and we probably could have completed it in 7 or 8 hours instead, but the reason for the extra time was mostly because me and my friend kept fucking up during a number of the platforming portions, as well as running into a number of odd bugs and glitches. And boy did we run into a few memorable ones. There was one really stupid but funny one, I believe, where I had fired myself out of a cannon from the ship that had served as our last checkpoint, with the intent of landing in the middle of this city that bordered the water. And I ultimately landed in a spot I don't think was fully rendered as a physical space by the developers, and thus I ended up falling through the map. Another great backfiring moment was when we were exiting the sewer canal via a one-way exit, only to realize that we had accidentally left behind the key that we needed to proceed farther into the level, and with no way to effectively get back in there, we were stuck in a catch-22 position. Bugs aside, however, never once did I feel like I was having my time wasted, and that may sound like a very offhand comment, but I've played quite a lot of games, and especially DLC, with pointlessly drawn out time waster quests, intent on just padding out the length unnecessarily, and not experiencing that drudge here is something I'm very grateful for. It is very difficult to craft a immersive and enjoyable experience that has a lot of great set pieces without it coming across to the players being excessively scripted, or to find a balance between high-intensity, adrenaline-filled action sequences and more low-key exploration, puzzle solving, and narrative-driven moments, but Rare seems to have mostly found that balance here. Another thing I liked was how right off the bat, there are no prerequisites for unlocking the A Pirate's Life campaign. Rare designed it specifically to appeal to both new and existing players as well, which is good because I'm not a particular fan of gating off content to only high-level players. Unless you're an MMORPG or something similar, which is designed around providing extensive endgame content, there's no reason to gatekeep gameplay content. All you need to do to activate the DLC is talk to the Outcast, a new NPC who looks and sounds like an off-brand imitation of Tia Dalma, who may in fact be a little bit less of an imitation than you might assume, from the original Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy. And this is where I kind of have to at least briefly touch on one of the obvious areas of criticism I've seen online from a ton of Pirates of the Caribbean fans, that being the complete absence of any of the original film actors and the rather obvious lack of likenesses granted for this expansion. The only character that kind of looks like himself is Jack Sparrow, and that's mostly because I suspect Johnny Depp, am I allowed to say that name on YouTube nowadays, I wonder, made some kind of extensive, possibly in perpetuity deal with Disney about using his likeness for Jack Sparrow-related merchandise and digital media appearances. Whereas Disney probably never considered the other actors notable enough to be worth signing to such deals. So instead we get the off-brand dollar store versions of them instead. My guess is that Rare probably wanted to get the original actors back, but my guess is that they would have specifically wanted Johnny Depp to return, and given how Johnny Depp has been placed on a McCarthy-like Hollywood-wide blacklist, Disney probably didn't want to deal with the PR temper tantrum from some of the bigger entertainment press outlets. And if they had extended an open invitation for all the other actors except Depp to reprise their roles, it probably would have made his exclusion a lot more noticeable. And if there's one thing Disney has shown consistently, it's that they care far more about their public image than they do about any financial cost. So I don't think Disney said no to bringing people back because it would have been too expensive, but just because it would have been too much of a PR hassle for them. But that said, the vocal talents, motion capture, and character models were all very well designed and for the most part fairly accurate to their film counterparts, at least setting aside the obvious aforementioned Marvel's Avengers-esque likeness deviations. Easily my favorite moment in the whole expansion was how Rare worked in almost the entire Pirates of the Caribbean theme park ride into Sea of Thieves itself, including bringing back almost every single set piece featured in said ride, and even a lot of the characters and original dialogue from the ride. I've been to Disney World maybe twice in my life, and went on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride probably 4 or 5 times. It's easily by far one of my favorite attractions in the whole park, despite how obviously aged it is in many ways. To me, that just adds to the appeal. It's a timeless experience and is really fun for me to experience that nostalgia here in a pirate's life. That said, if you play through this one level where you're in this town full of civilian ghosts, never find yourself stuck in the public square. The ghosts have a tendency to endlessly loop their words or conversations, and while it may be funny to hear the same voice lines repeated over and over again for the first minute or two, the appeal quickly drains out when you find yourself stuck within hearing range of it for the next half hour or so.
Do not tell him, Carlos.
Oh, this is cool.
Do not tell him, Carlos. No.
Now that we've discussed at length how things look and sound, let's talk about the most important factor, and that is how it feels to play. The actual gameplay and story quality. And this is, I think, where the game delves into a more hit or miss area, because the two aspects are so closely intertwined, I'm just kind of discussing them in one go. For a game that markets itself as being this free-ranging, pirate-themed sandbox adventure, it can be a little tricky to try to introduce a more scripted mode into the game. And by God, this campaign can feel very scripted at times. And you'd think that, well, if the gameplay is very well scripted, that means it's being heavily structured by a singular, cohesive story that provides you additional value in the place of that freedom, right? Well, that's the general idea at least, but the end result is far more questionable. If you really adore endless platforming puzzles interrupted only by lengthy walking simulations or heavy scripted set-piece action sequences, then this campaign is right up your alley. If you're looking for something reminiscent of, say, Portal 2's co-op multiplayer mode, just with a lot more hand-holding, boy, this is perfect for you. The puzzles, again, I felt were rather hit or miss. I'll admit I'm not a big fan of forcing in pointless puzzles into game genres where they don't really make sense to be included in, such as horror games or first-person action games, but if you're going to have them in there, at least have them be decent. And for the most part, I think many of the puzzles here were okay. Not great overall, but okay. Some of them I found to be ridiculously easy, like this one that involved lighting a number of lanterns scattered across this series of interconnected rooms in order to open this one barred door. Or a handful of separate platforming puzzles that effectively required 2 players to work together to get each other across a set of drawbridges, and lifts that would only lower or raise when one player was actively rotating an anchor or other similar controlling device. However, 1 or 2 of these puzzles were quite challenging and ultimately quite satisfying to solve. One decent moment was when we had to keep arranging this set of mermaid and merman statues into different positions in order to get the water in this underwater cave to rise and carry us up to the next level, before then immediately proceeding to do the exact same thing over and over again a few more times. Another being where we had to figure out how to rescue this cursed captain who basically is the Jar Jar Binks of this expansion, although without arguably the insensitive stereotyping in this case. When playing through that whole quest, we kept passing his head back and forth like a hot potato because neither of us wanted to be stuck holding his head for the entire quest. The really obvious downside both I and my other friend experienced throughout this campaign, and it's an observation we both made about the game long before this campaign was added, but it's doubly true here, is that the combat really isn't all that satisfying in many instances, doubly so when it's heavily scripted as it is here. And there's no reason why this should be the case. We're going on some of the most insane Pirates of the Caribbean-esque adventures ever introduced in Sea of Thieves. We're trying to outrun Davy Jones on his spectral ship. We go toe-to-toe with the Kraken in a direct battle. We duel against the Mermaid Queen. We fight off giant monster crabs with unnatural and mostly unexplained energy-casting abilities. We stow aboard the Ferry of the Damned, which carries the souls of the dead to the afterlife. And despite the awesome-sounding nature of these high-stakes moments, they're delivered with a somewhat lifeless zeal, something I attribute to how they chose to present the gameplay. I rarely got the feeling that anything I did in combat really mattered in the slightest, even though logically I knew that probably was not the case, but one of the most prominent reasons behind that is the lack of proper, meaningful visual feedback. This was especially annoying when we were fighting the Kraken, which really was probably the single worst, most boring sequence in the whole expansion. It was probably a 10 or 15 minute long stationary section where we fought off increasingly large waves of random enemies firing cannonballs at us, while we fired cannonballs back at them, before then dealing with Davy Jones's terrifying beastie. Well, at least in the films. The Sea of Thieves colorful, cartoony version of the Pirates of the Caribbean Kraken greatly reduces the scariness of the original design. But setting aside the fact that we were effectively forced into a meaningless on-rails boss fight, and setting aside the fact that the boss in question had nothing that could even somewhat resemble a diverse variety of signature attacks, instead seemingly content with just slapping us with its tentacles over and over again, endlessly every 15 seconds or so. Setting that aside, what we found really annoying was that there was no health bar for it, or the ever bosses during boss fights, nor any signs of increasingly extensive damage inflicted. Take, for example, games like Dauntless. Dauntless, very much like its obvious inspiration, the Monster Hunter series, is all about these drawn-out and elaborate boss fights against giant monsters. Except Dauntless, unlike Sea of Thieves, actually provides you a reasonable amount of visual feedback, indicating how much damage you've done to the boss by showing large cuts or scratches, or bits of their armor being chipped away in places. Additionally, in more recent years, Dauntless has finally given in to player demand and just added a boss health meter, which they probably should have done as an option from the beginning. But my point is, even without a traditional health bar, there are multiple ways of showing progress being made during a boss fight. You could go the more Doom Eternal route and have multiple stages during a boss fight, where in each of these stages, the boss changes up its attack behavior. There's lots of ways of creating a great memorable boss fight. Sea of Thieves ultimately chooses none of them here, which is really disappointing. As I mentioned at the start of this video, they actually have made notable strides towards making more interesting NPC combat in other areas, but sadly that is not reflected overall in a pirate's life, specifically. One final but possibly unfair criticism I feel at least worth voicing is my mild disappointment with how this expansion or update, whichever, has so little impact on the normal adventure mode experience. While it's great to see mermen and those weird giant crab things added to adventure mode as new enemy types, I was hoping for a bit more, like a new island or two. Maybe rework that outcast NPC into a faction leader or a vendor, who can offer up a new line of work for the player. Also, a new world boss or two for special events wouldn't have gone amiss either. But my biggest disappointment, and this is where I feel I might be setting the bar a bit high, but I would have loved to have been able to sail around Rare's interpretation of the Pirates of the Caribbean world in adventure mode, outside of just story quests. It would have been cool to sail back and forth between classic locations from the films as well as all new locations Rare designed themselves. I think if they had done that, connected these locations into one cohesive secondary world, similar in scale to the current world, but with plenty of opportunities to expand over time with new original locations, I think this would have been a truly revolutionary update. Similar in scale to how Fortnite completely nuked its original map in favor of a completely new one. Imagine how cool it would have been to open up the seas to all new locations on a scale never seen before, mostly by just reusing most of the locations and assets you've already employed in the Tall Tales. While I personally enjoyed the limited time updates added to Sea of Thieves over time, I almost always prefer content that has a permanent and irreversible impact on the game, something that makes the entire experience feel fresh and new once again. And I feel Rare tiptoed right up to the edge of that line without ever really going one toe over. For a free expansion for a AAA live service game, A Pirate's Life is an incredibly intricate and well-designed experience that does an excellent job of being respectful to the Pirates of the Caribbean IP, while also infusing it with Rare's own unique sense of humor and general game design approach. If you are already on the fence about buying Sea of Thieves, or if you're someone who's played it but stopped for one reason or another, this is a great reason to hop back in and play it again. While there are a number of valid criticisms of it to make, they are ultimately outweighed by the number of net positives on display here. On that note though, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. I feel like I could go into far greater detail on some of these points, but conversely, I think I've covered all the important details I wanted to today. On that note though, that's where I think I'm going to wrap up the video for today. As usual, if you enjoyed this video or found it informative, please be sure to give this video a like, share it around, and definitely let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'm always up for some healthy and vigorous debate in my comment section. We don't all have to agree, but as long as we can keep things fairly civil, I'm more than happy. If you want to support the work I do on this channel, subscribing and clicking the bell to opt into getting all notifications would really help. YouTube doesn't make it easy for people to find my videos, and it only takes maybe 2 button clicks to subscribe and enable notifications. Either way, thanks for joining me. As always, this is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.